All right, today we are diving into a really wild theory, one that reframes everything we thought we knew about myths. We're going to look at them not as fiction, but as something, well, something much more important, an ultimate survival code. So let me just start with a question that kind of flips the script on all those stories our ancestors told. What if they weren't just making up fanciful tales about gods and monsters? What if they were doing something incredibly practical?
And here it is. This is the core idea we're going to unpack, and it is a big one. This single sentence completely changes the game. It suggests that stories are what's left behind when everything else, cities, technology, even entire languages, just turns to dust. They're a kind of data storage.
Okay, so to really get this, we basically have to toss out our old definitions. We're not talking about mythology like you learned in school. We're talking about myth as a form of technology.
So here's our new working definition. I want you to think of a myth like a zip file. Seriously, it's this incredible way to package a massive amount of information. We're talking survival guides, social structures, even historical trauma, and shrink it down into a format that's super small, easy to remember, and unbelievably durable.
Yeah, this is a great way to put it. When a civilization's physical hard drives get wiped, when its libraries burn to the ground, this is the backup. The human mind itself, running on the software of story, becomes the last and maybe the only reliable archive. But how? How does this actually work? I mean, why is a simple story more resilient than a stone monument or a library full of books? The answer, it turns out, is in the very mechanics of what happens when things fall apart.
So when a complex society fails, its entire knowledge infrastructure is basically the first thing to go. Just think about it for a second. Literacy, that becomes a luxury. Centralized records are lost or destroyed. All that specialized knowledge, well, it just dies with the specialists. The whole system for storing complex information just vanishes. And what's left? What one person can tell another. That's it.
And this is exactly why stories are the perfect vehicle for that situation. See, our brains aren't really built to remember raw data or, long, boring instruction manuals. We are wired for patterns, for cause and effect, for things that make us feel something. A story encodes survival strategies not as a technical blueprint, but as a parable or an archetype, a format that's just way, way easier to remember and retell.
Now, of course, as this information gets passed down orally over hundreds, even thousands of years, it doesn't stay perfectly intact. I mean, how could it? It distorts. But this process isn't random. It's actually a pretty predictable degradation, kind of like a global game of telephone played across millennia.
And some researchers have actually mapped this out. They see it happening in 3 distinct phases. First, it starts as a literal historical account. This is what happened. Then, as the direct memory of the event fades, it gets more symbolic. And finally, after 10 or more generations have passed, it becomes this abstract, almost cosmological story where the original event is barely recognizable.
This is a fantastic example of that exact transformation. Just look at this. A literal historical event, you've got survivors from some high-tech group emerging from a shelter to help out less advanced tribes. It gets compressed over centuries. The bunker becomes the underworld. The survivors become gods. And sharing technology becomes the symbolic act of teaching humans fire. The core pattern survives, but all the details get converted into powerful metaphors.
So this is the really crucial point here. The shift into symbolism, it's not primitive thinking or people getting infused. No, it's an efficient data management strategy. When the original context is lost, the mind preserves the most important parts, the core relationships and the survival logic, by encoding them in symbols that last. It's a feature of our minds, not a bug.
Okay, so if this theory holds water, we should be able to find some evidence, right? We should see the same core stories, these same patterns popping up in cultures all over the world, even in cultures that never had any contact with each other. And, well, it turns out that's exactly what we find.
There appear to be 7 of them, 7 fundamental mythic archetypes that just keep recurring globally. According to this framework, these aren't just stories, they're cognitive fossils, the imprints left behind of solutions to survival problems that every single civilization eventually has to face.
Let's just run through 3 of the big ones. You've got the fallen city, think Atlantis or Babel. The theory is this isn't just a moral fable, it's a hard-coded warning against overcomplexity. Then there's the 2 peoples, giants and humans, gods and mortals. That's seen as the compressed memory of a post-collapse world, where maybe 2 different human survival strategies emerged. And of course, the reset flood. This one is everywhere, and it encodes a brutal memory. that of a total system collapse and the simple instruction to start completely fresh because the old way is broken beyond repair.
So why are these 7 stories universal? It's not because one culture taught another. It's because every single collapsing civilization, no matter where or when, runs into the same fundamental problems. So through a kind of convergent evolution of story, they generate the same fundamental myths to encode the solutions.
You see how this changes everything? If myths are a data format, then we can learn to read them. We can actually try to reverse engineer these ancient stories to map the forgotten cycles of human history.
So here's a super simplified look at how you might do that. First, you try to strip away all the symbolic layers to find the basic structure underneath. Then you look for that same structure in other totally unrelated cultures. That's a huge clue you're onto a core event. Then you ask the simple question, what behavior does this story teach? And finally, you try to reconstruct what the original literal story might have been before that long game of telephone began.
And really, this is what it all boils down to. While archaeologists are out there digging for pottery and bones, this theory suggests there's this whole other record we can look at, one that's far more durable and could potentially hold the history of cycles that left no other trace behind.
Which, of course, leaves us with a pretty fascinating and maybe a little unsettling final thought. If this whole process is real, then it's not just about the ancient past. It's happening right now. What collapses, what traumas, and what survival instructions are we encoding into the movies, the books, and the legends of our own time? What are the myths that our civilization will leave behind?